Picture this. You're standing in Westminster Abbey in London on a cold February morning in 1613, dressed in black mourning attire as you watch the elaborate funeral procession for Princess Elizabeth Stuart, beloved daughter of King James I. The ornate casket is carried by 8 pallbearers, followed by weeping courtiers and foreign dignitaries who have come to pay their respects. But if you could peer inside that magnificent coffin, you would discover the most audacious royal deception in English history. It's completely empty. What you're witnessing isn't a genuine funeral, but the final act of the most elaborate escape plan ever conceived by English royalty. Princess Elizabeth Stuart, faced with a political marriage she desperately wanted to avoid, had spent months orchestrating her own death, complete with forged medical reports, bribed physicians, and a network of conspirators who helped her disappear into ordinary life as a common citizen. Before we uncover this buried truth about one of the Stuart dynasty's most rebellious princesses, make sure to subscribe to Buried Truths and hit that notification bell. We're about to reveal how a royal daughter chose freedom over duty, transforming herself from princess to peasant in one of history's most successful identity transformations. Elizabeth Stuart was born in 1596 as the only daughter of James I, making her one of the most valuable political assets in early 17th century Europe. Her marriage prospects were constantly discussed in diplomatic circles, with every major European power seeking to secure her hand for their own strategic advantage. But Elizabeth had grown up watching her father use marriages as political tools, and she was determined not to become another pawn in the game of international diplomacy. The crisis that would drive Elizabeth to fake her own death began in 1612, when James I entered serious negotiations for her marriage to Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. The match was strategically brilliant. It would secure Protestant unity in Northern Europe while providing England with a powerful military ally. For Elizabeth, however, it represented a life sentence in a foreign court where she would never again control her own destiny. Elizabeth had spent her childhood in the relatively progressive English court, where she had received an education that was remarkable for its time. She could read and write in 6 languages, had studied mathematics and natural philosophy, and had developed interests in subjects that were typically forbidden to women. The prospect of being shipped off to Sweden to produce heirs for a man she had never met was unbearable. Her first attempts at resistance were conventional. She appealed directly to her father, claiming religious objections to the match, and arguing that her duty to England required her to remain in the country. When these arguments failed, she tried more dramatic measures, including public displays of illness and emotional distress that she hoped would convince potential suitors that she was unsuitable for marriage. But James I was unmoved by his daughter's protests. The political advantages of the Swedish marriage were too significant to abandon because of what he dismissed as feminine hysteria. The negotiations continued, and by late 1612 it became clear that Elizabeth would be married to Gustavus Adolphus, whether she consented or not. It was at this point that the princess began considering more desperate measures. Elizabeth's transformation from obedient daughter to master conspirator began with careful observation of palace life and the identification of potential allies among the court staff. She noticed that several servants had grown sympathetic to her plight, particularly older women who remembered their own powerlessness in the face of arranged marriages. These servants became the foundation of her escape network. The princess also cultivated relationships with court physicians, initially seeking their help in documenting illnesses that might delay her marriage negotiations. Through these interactions, she learned about medical practices and began developing the knowledge that would be essential for faking her own death convincingly. Elizabeth's plan required perfect timing and flawless execution. She decided to stage her death during the winter months when diseases were more common and sudden illnesses less suspicious. She began complaining of symptoms that suggested consumption, a disease that could progress rapidly and unpredictably, making it a perfect cover for her deception. The first phase of her plan involved gradually establishing a pattern of declining health that would make her sudden death believable. Elizabeth began appearing pale and weak at court functions, claiming fatigue and shortness of breath that suggested serious underlying illness. She arranged for trusted physicians to examine her and provide medical opinions that supported her claims of failing health. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was secretly making arrangements for her post-death life. She had saved money from her allowances and jewelry gifts, gradually converting valuable items into coins that could support her after her escape. She also arranged for clothing and other supplies to be hidden outside the palace, creating supply caches that would allow her to survive independently. The most complex aspect of Elizabeth's plan was creating a convincing death scene that would fool even the most experienced observers. She studied the symptoms and progression of consumption, learning how to simulate the physical signs of terminal illness. She practiced controlling her breathing and pulse, techniques that would be essential for appearing dead during medical examinations. Elizabeth's medical conspirators provided her with substances that could temporarily slow her heart rate and breathing to levels that would suggest death while keeping her alive. These preparations were derived from rare plants and required precise dosing to avoid actual death while achieving convincing simulation of mortality. The princess also had to arrange for a substitute body that would be buried in her place. Through her network of servants and sympathizers, she obtained the corpse of a young woman who had died of genuine consumption, someone whose death could be concealed while her body was prepared to serve as Elizabeth's false remains. The staging of Elizabeth's final illness began in January 1613 when she took to her bed claiming severe respiratory distress and fever. The court physicians were summoned and provided diagnoses that confirmed the princess's declining condition, though several were secretly part of her conspiracy and knew they were participating in an elaborate deception. Elizabeth's supposed deathbed scene was a masterpiece of theatrical performance. She appeared to struggle for breath while delivering what sounded like final words to her grief-stricken father. James I, believing his daughter was genuinely dying, summoned priests and foreign ambassadors to witness what he thought were her last moments. The moment of death itself was carefully choreographed, with Elizabeth using her practiced techniques to simulate the cessation of vital signs, while trusted physicians confirmed her passing to the assembled witnesses. The grief displayed by King James was genuine, as he believed he had lost his beloved daughter to the very disease she had been simulating. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's supposed death provided the perfect cover for her actual escape. While the court was consumed with funeral preparations and diplomatic notifications, the princess was secretly spirited away from Westminster Palace by her conspirators. The substitute corpse was prepared and placed in the coffin that would be displayed for public mourning. Elizabeth's transformation from princess to commoner required not just physical disguise, but complete personality reconstruction. She adopted the identity of a merchant's widow named Mary Thornton, a persona she had been developing for months. This new identity included a complete backstory, documentation, and even arrangements for housing in a small town far from London. The funeral of Princess Elizabeth Stuart was one of the most elaborate royal ceremonies of James I's reign. Foreign dignitaries attended to pay their respects, while the English court mourned what they believed was the loss of the king's only daughter. The irony that Elizabeth was probably watching from a distance, disguised among the common mourners, adds a surreal dimension to the entire spectacle. Elizabeth's new life as Mary Thornton was carefully planned to avoid suspicion while providing her with the freedom she had always desired. She settled in a small market town where she could use her education and intelligence without attracting attention to her unusual background. Her savings provided enough capital to establish a small business that would support her independently. The psychological challenges of her new identity were considerable. Elizabeth had to suppress not only her aristocratic mannerisms and speech patterns, but also her natural tendency to command and expect obedience. Learning to blend in as a common citizen required constant vigilance and self-control that was mentally exhausting. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth thrived in her new identity. For the first time in her life, she could make her own decisions, choose her own companions, and pursue her own interests without considering political implications. She used her education to become a teacher and writer, producing works under her assumed name that would never be connected to the missing princess. The long-term success of Elizabeth's deception required ongoing management of her false identity and careful avoidance of situations that might expose her true background. She had to maintain correspondence with trusted allies who could warn her of any investigations into her disappearance, while avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize her from her life as a princess. Elizabeth's escape had significant political consequences that rippled through European diplomatic circles. The sudden death of James I's daughter disrupted marriage negotiations with Sweden and forced the king to reconsider his alliance strategies. The loss of such a valuable diplomatic asset weakened England's negotiating position in several ongoing international disputes. The king's grief over his daughter's death was profound and long-lasting, affecting his decision-making in ways that influenced English policy for years afterward. James became more protective of his remaining children while also more suspicious of the physicians and courtiers who had been unable to save Elizabeth's life. Meanwhile, the real Elizabeth was building a life that would have been impossible as a princess. She eventually married a local merchant who knew nothing of her royal background, bearing children who grew up as ordinary English citizens with no knowledge of their extraordinary heritage. Her secret remained safe because no one was looking for a living princess among the common people. Elizabeth's story raises fascinating questions about identity, freedom, and the price of privilege. By choosing to die as a princess, she gained the opportunity to truly live as a person, but at the cost of everything she had known and everyone she had loved. Her sacrifice of family, status, and security for the sake of personal autonomy represents one of history's most extreme assertions of individual will against social expectation. The buried truth about Elizabeth Stuart's fake death remained hidden for centuries, known only through coded letters and documents that were never meant to survive. The discovery of these materials in recent decades has revealed not just the facts of her escape, but also the sophisticated network of accomplices who made her transformation possible. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most restrictive societies, determined individuals can find ways to assert their freedom and control their destinies. Elizabeth's willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of autonomy demonstrates the universal human desire for self-determination that transcends social boundaries and historical periods. When Elizabeth Stuart finally died, genuinely this time, in 1669, she was buried as Mary Thornton in a small country churchyard, her grave marked only with her assumed name. The princess who had escaped the confines of royalty through an elaborate death hoax had found the peace and freedom she had always sought, living and dying on her own terms rather than those imposed by political necessity. The woman who faked her death to escape marriage had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, transforming herself so completely that history itself forgot she had ever lived beyond 1613. Her ultimate victory was not just escaping an unwanted marriage, but disappearing so thoroughly that she became the author of her own story rather than a character in someone else's political drama.